Thank you. Welcome everybody to the next EPAC meeting. I know this is probably most folks' first day back from the holiday break, so I hope everybody had a nice, safe and relaxing break. Now it's time for us to all try to switch back into CGPP mode and scenario development mode on this Monday afternoon. So I just want to give a quick reminder of where we are at the moment in the EPAC. We have spent the last couple EPAC meetings going over what the potential scenario themes could be for scenarios 2 and 3 of the CGPP modeling for the capacity expansion model. We've kind of landed on a couple of high-level scenarios that could kind of bound our transmission need analysis, and that was primarily what was presented last week by the JU around a low, bundling some scenario themes that were developed by the EPAC to create kind of a low transmission needs scenario, and then another one that might result in a higher transmission needs scenario. What was done last week was kind of giving the high-level overview of what those two scenarios might be like, what types of assumptions might need to be changed, and which ones could be bundled together to create those scenarios. And this week we want to go a little bit deeper, or as deep as we can on one or maybe both of those if we have time. So we can try to start putting some of the finishing touches on what these scenario matrices would be like, what the assumptions will be, so we can hand those over to the New York ISO to kick off that modeling. Just a couple of quick pieces of information here. You can use the chat to do any questions. We'll also be doing hand raises. I am about to turn it over to the JU to take over the meeting and do lead the discussion. But I did also want to remind folks that a few emails had gone out before the Thanksgiving break with some information about the scenarios presented last time, but also another kind of request for feedback on some of the scenarios and other items on the timeline and the headroom analysis. So if you wanted to read those or provide any additional feedback, you still have time to do that. We're aggregating that feedback as it comes in and trying to pass that along as quickly as we can so that it can be addressed on these calls and also between calls as we have more information from the folks that need to respond. So if you haven't already, check those emails. We have received responses from a few folks, but I know there's a lot more folks on here that receive those emails, so you can go back and read those if you'd like and provide some more feedback via email as well. I also wanted to note, and this is kind of late breaking news, that the 0x40 technical conference that's coming up in December, the day one of that conference on December 11th is scheduled on the same day as our next EPAC meeting, and it looks like the very tail end of that technical conference might overlap with the December 11th EPAC meeting. And so we'll be sending an email out about that to folks to try to poll folks to see if that's a conflict for some people, or if we should just keep the meeting because both events, both the EPAC and the technical conference, will be recorded. So it's not the worst thing in the world, but want to see if folks would rather push this by a day or two, or pull it back a day or two, just to see what folks think about that. So we'll be sending emails about that after the meeting. But with that, I'm going to stop my remarks and see if there's any quick questions before we dive into the material for this week. All right, sounds good. You have the ability to raise your hand at any point and also enter information in the chat if you'd like. But with that, I will hand it over to the JU to take over the meeting.
Thanks, Skylar. Can folks hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Had to check again. So my name is Tom. I think you all heard me talk last time. I'm here representing National Grid and the joint utilities, as well as my joint utilities colleagues here who are going to be very helpful in supporting me as I go through some of this presentation. Like Skylar mentioned, I think the goal today is we'll just glance over the high level scenario assumptions that we talked about over the last couple sessions. make sure that we're all on the same page, and then dive into the NISO matrix to see what that means in terms of actual changes to inputs into the capacity expansion model, talk through some of those changes, and then we'll spend the majority of our time probably talking through the loading assumptions that we want to make some changes around. I put together some tables and reference information that NYSERDA had sent over regarding some of these cases that we're looking at, as well as looking at some of NISO's cases that I'll walk folks through. And like Skylar mentioned, please drop any questions in the chat or raise your hand. There may be some questions that we're not able to answer about particularly details on the loading scenarios that were developed in the past, but we'll make sure to catalog them in the chat and follow up with NYSERDA or NISO or whoever has much more detail behind the scenario. So with that, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Looks like folks can see that.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, so you should recognize this. This is the scenario 2 and 3 high-level assumption matrix we talked about last time we were here. I've highlighted the topics that are probably worth talking about today. I think we're going to start by focusing on scenario 3, the set of assumptions that we expect to have maybe more of a transmission impact, and then next time we'll come back and talk about the lower transmission impact or after this one. And as we discussed last time, our goals here around are to make reasonable assumptions, try and create bookends on the results, and limit the number of variables we modify so that we can make sense of the results. They can be highly meaningful. So what we've landed on through those goals is to, one, modify the peak load forecast. So we've come to the conclusion that load forecast is probably the biggest driver of variability among capacity expansion scenarios. And we want to focus on it for that reason. It also is an area where there's a big range of reasonable futures. One of the suggestions that we've made here is to align with the Climate Action Council Integration Analysis Scenario 3, which is the accelerated transition away from combustion. And as an alternative, we've talked about the NISO higher demand policy case. And I'll walk through some of both of those. Before I do that, just to remind folks, the other adjustment that we talked about in the high transmission impact case is to look at DFERs, dispatchable emission-free resources that will help us meet our carbon goals in the face of intermittency. Essentially, the limitation we've talked about there that we'll show in the NISO matrix is modifying the start year for when both new and retrofit DFERs can come into play and meet needs. And we'll talk about exactly how we did that in the NISO matrix, different for new build versus retrofit. Any questions, comments before I move over? So this is the NISO assumption matrix. This is the more detailed set of inputs that NISO needs to be able to run the models that they're going to be running for us over the next couple of months. And what I've done is simplified this by highlighting the areas that we're talking about today. So as you'll see as we go through, intentionally, many of the variables are the same. You might say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why are we keeping everything the same when the point is to be divergent? Well, some things aren't different among scenarios. You know, physics is physics, so we don't want to be messing with that. And two, we want to make sure that the variables we're changing are very meaningful, which load tends to hit that mark. So scrolling down, you can see the difference between the three cases. We're going to focus on the difference between the high and the state scenario. As folks know, the state scenario aligns very closely with the recommended scenario from the Climate Action Council forecast in the integration analysis. And what we're suggesting here is scenario 3, the shift away from combustion. Jumping over to this table, I wanted to pull together some highlights from that Climate Action Council case, because it seems like in the last call, we had a lot of questions about what it means to have higher load or lower load, how it aligns with policy or doesn't align. So I'd be happy to share this after the call. This is all stuff that I took right from NYSERDA's webpage, but it might be easier to see it all together as opposed to going through the Climate Action Council reports and some of the attachments. But essentially, this is all the detail you could ever want around what's under the hood of this forecast and how it breaks down to individual state targets. As you can see, for example, down here, it talks about which of the CLCPA goals it's hitting and how. So as a start, I liked this figure 5 here. Helped me get an overview of what's different about this scenario compared to some others. So really the biggest difference between it and some of these other scenarios here, namely scenario 2, is electrification. It has a much higher degree of electrification. Not to say that scenario 2 doesn't. So like we said earlier, some of these lower electrification cases still are showing huge amounts of load increase, as you can see here, indicated by the high indicator here. But it's just that we're going even higher than that. The specifics and the numbers, again, are up here in the gory details. Again, some other obvious increases. Electric vehicles are going up. That makes sense. Low carbon fuels are going down. There's more of a dependence on electricity as implied by the transition away from combustion. And there's some other impacts that are not necessarily affecting our model directly, but are worth talking about. For example, increasing carbon sequestration or increasing, for example, energy efficiency, which will actually go to offset some of the load increases that you would expect to see in this case. And we'll talk about it in a little bit. But walking through this figure 7, this sort of highlights exactly where different pieces of our policy affect the load forecast as envisioned through this chart here, which shows carbon emissions to the state over the years, again, comparable to, related to load electrification. And you can see, particularly as we go further out, the items in red identify where this case diverges from case 1 and case 2. And you can see as we get out to 2030, and particularly 2035 and 2040, you're seeing a lot of the electrification come into play, increases in zero emission light duty vehicles, as well as medium and heavy duty vehicles, which have much less of an impact in the lower cases, and an accelerated transition of building electrification as well. Though, like I said, that's offset a little bit by an increase in building weatherization.
Hey, Tom, we have, I think, a hand raised.
Please, because I would just keep going forever.
Good afternoon. This is Chi from NISO. Thank you so much for this diagram. It's very helpful. So my question is not only about transition away, but also probably linked to retirement. Just wondering, have we discussed the treatment of the generators right now, the fossil generators that are necessary for the local reliability purposes? As in, there are some generators need to be retained as of now, either for steam or for voltage or for whatever reason. If we have already discussed, I apologize, but this is probably just a matter of educating me, letting me know what we're going to do about it. Thank you.
No, it's a good question, and I will need a little bit of help from some of my modeling friends here at the JU. But as a first answer to your generation retirement question, I believe the plan is to align with what you've done for the state scenario here, as opposed to what you're doing in the outlook. And what we mean by that is aligning with the age-based retirement threshold, as opposed to keeping things running until 2040 when they spool down, which I believe how you do it. And then we were talking about potentially modifying those age-based retirement thresholds for the high and the low cases, though we hadn't really gotten into detail on that. But I'll pause for any of my colleagues from the JU who want to speak to generation retirement and what we're thinking for these cases, if I have it right or wrong. Guess I nailed it. Chi, does that answer your question?
Thank you. So in other words, there are some local issues that this is mainly as in when we go on to the next stage, like power flow analysis, there are some generator needed for voltage issue. Then so once those units retire as an H base, then the issue will surface at that point for us to resolve, right?
Correct. The model would have to resolve that issue, is my understanding.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I guess then that's extend to the other side of the equation. And absolutely, I don't need the answer right now, not to put you on spot. But those units that also provide steam, then do we say there would be other ways to provide steam, or we're saying those potentially can be candidates to use, say, green hydrogen? Again, don't need an answer right now, but if you have one, I'm happy to have a discussion. Thank you.
I'll note that as a takeaway, unless anyone else on the JU has a good answer for that right now.
Yeah. Tom, this is Martin from Canet. Can I jump in on that one?
Please.
There's still electric boilers. We can actually transition away from, units that provide steam to our system to electric boilers and go with that. And that would essentially mean additional load on our system.
Thank you, Martin. That makes a lot of sense. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Any other questions before I go back to the load forecast?
I just have a clarifying question. This is Erin Hogan. In your response to G regarding the voltage, when you say the model will solve that, are you saying in the power flow you could identify voltage problems and then you folks would have to design something to compensate for the voltage? Because I just want to confirm, like, we're clear on what the resource expansion model is capable of doing. I didn't think it addressed voltage.
Erin, I can start answering the question, and of course, JU, please jump in and correct me. And this is a great opportunity to clarify. And I agree with you, capacity expansion does not do voltage issue. But when we have capacity expansion, when we're identifying, moving on to compile the power flow cases, eventually to identify the issues we need to solve, reliability, voltage support being one of them, that having these fossil retire in the capacity expansion, production cost simulation, eventually that means when we are looking at the power flow cases, those issues like voltage support will surface. That's how I have in mind. And please, Skylar, JU, please correct me.
Hey, this is Nicholas Culpepper with PCG Long Island. You're absolutely correct in that we wouldn't expect to identify the voltage in the CapEx steps, but when we go to the nodal power flow representation, that we would be able to observe and address voltage reliability constraints.
That's what I thought, but I just wanted to confirm my understanding. So thank you.
Oh, we had another hand.
Yeah, it's Raya Salter, Energy Justice Law and Policy Center. I just had a follow-on question about the retirements. I heard you talk about age base, and if you could elaborate, or I presume that the analysis is also taking into account the requirements of the Build Public Renewables Act in terms of the peaker plants in New York City. And I would also hope and encourage that, there would not be, hydrogen retrofit considerations for the for those. So if you could speak to, I guess, the Build Public Renewables Act in the context of retirements. Oh. Hello?
Hi there. Sorry.
Oh.
I think I'm leaving a little air. Maybe somebody from Con Ed or downstate would be able to speak a little bit more to those impacts, because they're definitely going to be more impactful in that region.
I apologize, Ryan. This is Nicholas Culpepper with PCG Long Island. Would you mind restating the question?
Just asking how, in the context of retirements, what is the plan for the requirements of the Build Public Renewables Act, the law that was passed in the budget last year that was a continuation of the PSC blueprint to close NYPA's peakers?
Yeah, I'm not sure I entirely follow. I guess in
Oh,
attempt to
oh
kind
wait,
of
well,
address the
let
general.
me, I'll say it again, I guess. I just,
Oh, I'm
all
sorry.
folk,
Yeah, go
oh, no,
ahead.
no, it's okay. So as folks know, well, in the Climate Action Council process, you know, we worked with the department and the, you know, and the utilities on, you know, this idea of what is the blueprint for closing New York City's peaker plants. And then in the budget, you know, that actually was made into law with the Build Public Renewables Act, that needs to happen. And so in terms of retirements, I had presumed that those retirements would be reflected or built in. I guess I'm just asking for how that's going to be treated.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, unfortunately, I'd have to lean on Con Ed for specifics on the New York City. I don't know if they would know directly, but at a high level, whatever retirement assumptions are spit out of the CapEx model would directly go into the nodal representation and will likely drive the need for transmission development to support the transmission needs as a result of those retirements.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is Martin Patrick from Carnet. I think this is a question to NIPA and really their plans going forward, because it's really nothing official. I know there's a law, but we don't know what NIPA is going to actually do, are going to approach it. So it's really not really Carnet question or LIPA question. It's really a NIPA question.
The only thing I would add on this is that we do have, I think in both the base scenario and the other two cases, we are building in the NIPA small gas plant retirements in 2031. So they end by the end of 2030, they'll close.
Okay, so it is in the model, is what you're saying.
Yes, for the
All
NIPA,
right.
for the NIPA plants, it would be, yep.
For the NIPA plants. Okay, thank you very much.
Question on the phone.
Please.
So how are you managing the timing differences between a generator unit retiring and the need for transmission upgrade? Because you could have, for example, just what the discussion that just took place, 2030 for the NIPA units. But if your transmission solution takes longer than that, how do you deal with that timing difference?
This is Nicholas Culpepper with PSG Long Island. I would say one way to address that is just at a high level, right? Is first we want to know what those needs are first, right? Because we don't know whether there's going to be a constraint to get those transmission solutions in or not until we know what the limitations are. So I would say that would be our starting point, and as part of our efforts to come up with solutions and alternative solutions, I'd like to think that we'd be able to identify those constraints and incorporate a more appropriate solution, whether there be a need to have an alternative to a transmission to build out. Does that help answer your question?
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
I have another hand up. I think Julia.
Yeah, hi, this is Julie Cascani from New York City. I don't have anything else to add there. I just wanted to reiterate the importance of that question that was just brought up on the retirement and the transmission needs, because of course that's the situation that we're in right now in New York City with the DEC rule and the peaker retirements that are being postponed because of the transmission that's not on. So nothing additional to add, but I appreciate and would reiterate the importance of that.
Yep, that's the importance of this being kind of an iterative process, because that the capacity expansion model will have obviously some reliability representation to make sure that we are providing enough energy where and when it is needed. But then there is that, stage 2 through 4 phase where we have to check that generation build out, jives with all the other transmission security needs and other reliability issues at a more local level. And we may, there is a chance that we may have additional needs that we have to plan for as we iterate through this process. So it's definitely something we need to track, especially since we're kind of living it already today.
Any other questions before I jump back into the forecast?
Okay. So like we talked about here, I'm happy to share this. This goes over the high level, the incredibly low level, and everything in between on what this scenario is and what's under the hood on it in terms of gas usage, electrolysis load, and I even put a comparison for how it compares to NISO's forecasts here, and was able to throw together just recently. So don't hold me to these tables and numbers. They were done pretty quickly, but throw together some charts here to help you visualize the differences among some of these cases, with the orange line being the one that we're proposing here, the CAC accelerated case, scenario 3, and the gray lines being the NISO high case from the 2022 Gold Book. And I highlighted the rows here, or the columns here, that are probably the years of most interest for CGPP, just to highlight them for you. 2035 and 2042 are two of the, or nearly two of the run years that will probably determine a lot of the outcomes. But as you can see, high level trends, summer peak, the NISO forecast is consistently ahead of the CAC forecasts, a little less optimistic on, I think, some of the efficiency measures that the CAC forecast assumes. Winter peak is a little more in line as you get out to 2050, though there's some differences in the middle here. But you could see the NISO case and the accelerated transition case, the two we're considering, follow pretty closely in the time frame we're most concerned with, that 2035 to 2045 type area. And then energy usage, we actually have a different trend, which is interesting to look at. That NISO's high load case is actually on the lower end, particularly as you go out, where the CAC cases show quite a large growth in energy consumption, potentially indicating use of flexible resources, or other measures to move high consumption off of peak in the CAC cases relative to the NISO case. So again, there's more to talk about here, differences among these, what's under the hood on each of them, but I figured put together some interesting takeaways to help this group appreciate what these scenarios are, why they're different, how they're different, and maybe how it could drive some outcomes by being different. I'll pause again, questions, comments, thoughts.
I see Rodica, raise your hand. And Raya, your hand's up too, just in case you need to take that down.
Thank you, Skylar. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tom, for presenting this. I do have a question on the summer peak. So it's much higher for New York ISO high policy case. So is the GU's view that a high demand scenario would not be close to New York ISO high demand scenario?
I wouldn't say it's our view necessarily. We thought it was important to pick pre-existing scenarios for the purposes of alignment, and frankly to make it so that we can do these things in the timelines that we have to do them in. But I'm not sure that we're necessarily prescribing one versus the other. I will say I also have in here some of the comparisons in the NISO forecast that maybe can help us drive some differentiation. I don't know if anyone on the line from NISO can recall what some of the drivers were behind those differences between the CAC and the NISO peak loads in the summer.
And from a vintage standpoint, would the New York ISO high demand case be more up to date than the prior analysis?
It's slightly more recent, I think a year and a half, but also has slightly different goals, right? The CAC is squarely focused on policy achievement. It aligns with our state scenario because that's one of the ones we picked there. And the other benefit of maybe not aligning with the NISO case is that we're going to get the benefit of seeing the impact of the high load case through the outlook regardless. So there might be a benefit to differentiating. But I actually agree with the points that you're making, Rodica. And this is a high impact case. Why not go for the higher load? I think that's warranted comment.
Yeah, that's my question. And from a vintage standpoint, and I don't know what methodology New York ISO is using, maybe Yachi can talk a little bit more about this or in future presentations. But that would be my question. Like, should there be some sort of alignment between a high demand case between New York ISO and this exercise? Thank you.
John Bartiger with NYSERDA. I just want to note really quickly that while the initial integration analysis was conducted, prior to the publication of the final scoping plan, there has been continued work and updates. So the information that Tom is sharing is actually updated from the initial integration analysis. At a high level, it's still consistent, but we've continued to make updates to certain assumptions. So I would say there's not as much of a concern from a vintage standpoint from that perspective.
That's good to know, John. This is y'all are updating those. I just want to make sure I have the right data, and if not, I'll go back and change them. Y'all are updating those links on the Climate Action Council Scoping Plan webpage, those appendices.
The integration, the link I provided you recently, is actually not the actual scoping plan webpage. It's a separate webpage for the that ongoing work, and that's where folks can find that the information that's been updated since the initial work done for the scoping plan.
Excellent. So I'm not sure which one I used. I had a bunch of web pages open this morning, but I'll make sure to use the updated one if I share anything with this group. But thank you, John.
This is Chi from NYSO. Perhaps I can jump in here.
Please.
So for the high demand, this is Veronica's question. For the high demand policy cases, there are two notable differences. One is that there's assumes a lot of the EV. So 100% light duty vehicle sales saturation by 2035, for example, over 7 million EV on the road by 2040. So there is, and also we assume decreased share of managed charging relative to the baseline. So that drives up the summer load. And the other big aspect is the large loads, specifically like chip factories and so those assuming what we know, assuming there's like a full achievement of the large loads that we know already, and those loads come in pretty much the full time. So if you have actually Tom is showing the table right now, but those are the two main drivers that I can recall right now. You often hear NYSO talk about the building electrification that being a driver. That actually meant the changes more in the winter time rather than summertime. I think your question is focusing why the summer peak load is like significantly higher. Those are the two main drivers I would expect.
And you bring up a good point, Chi, that I want to emphasize as well is that as we're transitioning to a winter peak, that's probably going to be in a lot of cases the need that drives the outcome as opposed to the summer peak. Yeah, we're a little closer.
I think you would need to have some of my colleagues who are more involved with the integration analysis elaborate on some of the details here, but I know we've done a number of comparisons in the past, and with the high demand case, I think we've had some issues with some of the assumptions there relative to the approach we've taken. I think Chi elaborated on some of the managed charging, and then also what the heat pump and resistive heating assumptions are in different cases. So I think we really felt that if you want worst case scenario, quote unquote, I guess you can pick it. But I think we're pretty committed that beneficial electrification policy that'll move forward is going to have components to it to have managed charging and not have to have assumptions that more maybe align with the orange line than the gray.
I definitely see David's point. This is Chi again, sorry, the NYSO. So I think what the purpose of the scenario is so that we see a bookend. That's how I look at it. And it's just, whether this is the CGPP or it's NYSO's work, I see scenario as providing us with a bookend on what are the possible outcomes, what could be efficiently or very effectively impacting the the capacity expansion, where capacity is going to be located, what kind of capacity, and at the same time is what are a good measure to help us achieve the policy. And I think the state scenario, having the state policy achievement makes a lot of sense. What I would like to urge the group is, and these are the scenarios to help us see, say what's the system expansion that's going to be needed among all the different scenarios. So I'm leaning towards having a variety of different loads and then some other assumptions as well. I would, and from the application perspective, I would think using the high load demand makes sense to give us a guardrail per se. But I'm also interested in hearing what the group have in mind.
If I can, maybe 2 follow-up questions on this. Yachi, on something you said about large loads. So are the large loads announced and included in New York ISO? I assume even in the base case it's included. Like, are the large loads included here as well? And
only some of them. The baseline forecast only has some of the large loads, and then the high demand has pretty much all of the one they are announced. Again, it's not because of a lack of confidence or economic driver or anything. It's just that these large loads historically, just from the past few years, they have a tendency of uncertainty, and we just really have very varying luck of when they come in and how much they come in. So the baseline forecasts actually assume only some of them come to fruition, and the more details in the goal book. But in the high demand, it's just we assume there's more.
thank you. And the state scenario is not represented here, correct, Tom? Like, you don't have I'll be curious how the state scenario demand is.
So I may have picked the wrong one. I picked the AP recommends, which is scenario 1, and I think the state scenario is actually closer to a modified version of scenario 2. But folks, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But that's why I put the AP. This is the one that the scoping plan was built off of as a reference case.
In the scenario 2, the original load forecast used in the state scenario, the large loads were not in it, but we did decide to include them as part of the state scenario. So that I would assume that should probably flow through to these assumptions. However, we can include as many of those as we think we can, because I think we have the underlying data from the Gold Book.
So that's a good question. I guess I don't know if this is a NYSERDA question or maybe a follow-up for later, but there was a lot of work done to that state scenario to sort of bring it up to date, right, and make it relevant for our analysis today. John Barnaker, you alluded to similar work on other scenarios. Is it comparable, or are we going to have to go under the hood? We feel similar to what we did for the state scenario, to your point, Skylar, on these, and make some tweaks to make them fully relevant.
That's one of the things that we would have to get some of our integration analysis FSMEs on for the details of. But what you see posted to NYSERDA's websites does not include those adjustments for large loads that we made to the scenario 2 load forecast to incorporate large load information that became available following the development of those forecasts.
So maybe as a follow-up here, I don't know, Skylar, if this is a note for you, but we'll go back and not just look at the outputs of that state scenario, but all the steps that we're taking to modify it from what it was before.
Yeah.
And maybe review those we'll take it back, review it as the JU, see what makes sense, aim to apply as many of them as we can here for consistency's sake.
Yep, my understanding, it was very straightforward. The NISO did have all that information from a megawatt and megawatt hour perspective by zone. And so though that data was available, and since it was not existing in the initial integration analysis forecast that we were using for the state scenario, we just basically got to layer it on it, just completely additive to that scenario. And my understanding is it would probably be the same thing here, that we'd be able to just combine those two pieces of information if we do decide to have all those large loads in this scenario as well. But we'll take that back and clarify what the steps would be, and if we want to have a discussion here about whether to do all the loads in this, I think it makes sense to, especially if we're looking at the higher transmission case. But happy to have a discussion on that as well. And sorry, Bill, you've had your hand up forever. I promise we'll get to you in just a second.
Okay, just to wrap that up, Skylar, I think that makes sense, and I wouldn't limit it to just any modifications related to building load. If there was any other tweaks done to that scenario, like for example, adding in electrolysis load, let's note all the steps, and then we'll evaluate whether to implement them for the high load scenario as well.
Absolutely. Okay, sorry, Bill, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Scott. Bill Acker, Tom. I want to make sure I'm understanding this in the context of the two scenarios we were talking about earlier. So it certainly makes sense to me that you've chosen a variant on scenario 3 of the Climate Action Council, the high electrification, and it certainly makes sense to me that the conversation just occurred where we try to build in all of the high loads that should be built into the scenario. Is it your intention then that this is the basis for the high load scenario that we talked about, and you haven't yet addressed the other scenario that we're talked about, which was effectively the low load scenario of the high DERs? So I just want to make sure I'm clear on where we are on that one as well, and how we're going to tie that together. So I just want to make sure I'm on the same page here with you on that. This is the high load basis, and that we still have a little bit of work to do. You're focused on the load side of it, which makes a lot of sense, and I agree with what you said so far. And that there's some work to do on that scenario to flesh out on the generation side with whether we're doing less DFERs and more long duration storage or more other things to support the move to less DFERs, and that we still have the second scenario of the high DER, lower load, hyperlocal, that we have to address in the next set of discussions. Is that where you are on this?
Yeah, and it's probably a good time to mention generally our thoughts there. We strategically brought the high load one here first, yeah, because it's the one that a little easier to figure out for us to wrap our heads around. We have an idea of where we want to go. For low transmission impacts, we haven't exactly figured out how to implement some of the tweaks that we talked about last time, but I will say we heard the group loud and clear that we like the idea that there's a lower loading, and that you're talking about DER as mitigating the need for load, but you want to see more than just a reduction in load. You want to see an impact from DER and be able to speak to it. So that's something we're sort of working through, how to implement that, if we can do it in a way that makes sense for the models and the scenario, as part of the feedback we took back from EPPAC. So I would expect that our next session, we're ready to talk a little bit more about that low load scenario and how we took in the DER feedback that y'all gave us last session.
Great. That makes a lot of sense, and I'm looking forward to that conversation. For this high transmission impact scenario, the question on the generation side that was raised before of potentially going to limiting DFERs, I made the point last time that it seems like we can't just eliminate them. We have to obviously solve reliability problems, and so that might mean long duration storage. It might mean other things. Any further thoughts on that piece of it?
So again, this is probably more for the low scenario, but we talked about in the low transmission impact potentially utilizing the lower storage cost. I did go through the CAC's assumptions from their resource costs and found what it was for the mid case, which is I think what's represented already, versus the lower case, and it is a slightly lower number that gets much lower as you go out further. So that might be a differentiation in how we handle storage. But in terms of storage as a transmission asset, I would encourage, and I know you're very active there, Bill, but encourage more focus on the Advanced Technology Working Group, ATWG, because what they're working on right now, and I think they have their working group meeting this week,
is a planning criteria and guideline to help this team here, the modelers and planners, determine how to model storage as a transmission asset, not just as a market tool, but as something just distinctly meant to meet transmission needs that otherwise transmission might have to do. So making sure that group is set up to understand storage's capabilities and how it should be modeled and what it can do and what it can't do and how effectively it can do it is probably going to be the best way to make sure that not just market storage, but storage of a transmission asset meant to meet transmission needs is well integrated into this process in the middle stages.
Yep. Well, that seems reasonable. I guess so for this high transmission impact, I know I frequently wear the storage hat, but I'm really asking a broader question here, Tom. Of I think the desire of the group was to reduce DFERS in that scenario, and obviously we can't just wave a magic wand and have DFERS be reduced without some other way to meet reliability. So I'm just trying to tease out what the thoughts are on that piece of it. And I offered up long duration storage. Maybe I shouldn't have even said that because it took you down the storage path. I'm kind of just asking, how are you thinking about, the DFER reduction as part of this scenario?
Okay, good question. So that's the other half of the component here. So we might as well spend a little bit of time talking about it. That's the only other change that we're suggesting on this assumption matrix related to the high case. The only other big change, like we mentioned, there'll have to be little tweaks, like Skylar had mentioned earlier. But the current state scenario has new hydrogen combustion and combined cycle available in 2031 for new build as a DFER, and then retrofit of the similar type of technology by 2035. And the only change we proposed here in the high case is to limit all of those until 2035, just because 2031 is right around the corner, and this is pretty novel technology in a high impact case. Now that might have the problem, especially the years up to 2035, or if we have annual build caps that make it so that it can't build enough by 2040, for example, where the model might not be able to solve or might not want to solve. And I'll ask for a little bit of help from my more technical modeling colleagues here, but essentially some of the fixes that we've thought of for that are to your point, storage is a good resource to mitigate some of those needs. Additionally, if we're finding the model isn't solved, we could increase the flexibility of some of the non-dispatchable resources, particularly wind, to cover some gaps. But any other things to add from the JU side in terms of mitigation for that non-solved case on the DFER problem here in the high case, and any other questions on the EPPAC side?
It's Liz. I see Chris had raised his hand again.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Just a real quick question on that, Tom, would be if you increase the year from 2030 to 2035 for DFERS, and you're also changing the retirement to I believe you said a 60-year rule. How many existing units that will hit that 60-year rule somewhere between 30 and 35?
I think some of them have hit it now. So I know NISO has run into this issue, and that's the reason that NISO does it a little differently in the outlook to the point that she made earlier about asking about local reliability pockets and how to mitigate that challenge. So I do expect as we go into the actual modeling, there's going to have to be some tweaks we make case by case where some generation is left on if we can do so and meet policy that doesn't perfectly align with the scenario assumption we have here. That's my expectation, but I'll pause for others.
In terms of,
This is
sorry,
Chi.
go ahead, Chi.
Thank you. Is it fair to say we are really looking for system planning in normal operating condition for the CGPP? The reason why I said it is because right now we're looking for the very high level, big picture issues in just to find out how to operate it under normal conditions in a reliable way. But there's gonna be the next level questions such as extreme weather. which I don't think that's what the purpose of these scenarios are, right?
No, I think the goal is renewable energy deliverability, though I know they'll be looking at certain reliability aspects as we go through the middle stages.
Okay, all right. Then I again, a little bit more context is that for the normal operating condition, certainly that then will result in the set of the build out. And if there's gonna be further questions such as extreme weather, or focusing on the days that have very low renewable energy, then the results may also become different. But we're not trying to boil the ocean here. I get that, but I just want to also while we're doing the comprehensive this T&D planning, I just also want to urge everyone to keep that in mind. Thank you.
And Tom, one other question on the assumed retirements at 60 years. And I'm going back to kind of when Huntley and Dunkirk were retired, and they created some additional transmission considerations in the western part of the state. Do you foresee that those type of outcomes will be determined in the modeling?
In terms of statewide impacts of generation retirement from a reliability resiliency standpoint?
Not so much reliability, but more, it created new transmission needs, right? When those units went into retirement, it created a need to add additional transmission and in some cases distribution in order to move megawatts around and out of zone A. Do you envision this modeling will capture those type of effects?
I think it would. I don't know if I expect to see those type of effects or not. I'm not saying that, but I think if the model has the capability to capture something like that, if that's what you're asking.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Tom, one of the things you said earlier sparked something in my mind about build limits, because there's two considerations really in the model if you're trying to limit the defers is whether you allow them to be built in any year, but then also what is the quantity that is allowed to be built in any given year. There's different ways to toggle that. One is just making them way more expensive, and then that just changes the model's brain a bit and makes the model make different decisions. But there can also be a way to limit the total amount of builds, not necessarily to zero, obviously, because we've had some experience with that not being able to solve if there's literally no availability of firm resources. But there was a proposal submitted by some EPPAC members around like how to kind of choose a middle number as a limit instead of having to deal with all these like start years versus build limits per year, all that type of stuff, which would be to kind of go into the list of generation units in especially downstate New York and identify which of those units are located within disadvantaged communities and which ones are not. And then just use that number, the number of units that are eligible for transition to hydrogen, limit that to only the units that are outside of DACs, because then the number is not zero, and you don't have to build limits, but you're picking a number with some basis in reality around what's the total quantity of defers that are allowed to be made that will be less than in a traditional scenario. So that was one proposal set forth that I'd be interested to hear everybody's thoughts about.
Sounds interesting to me. Scratches a few itches in terms of meeting the disadvantaged community policy and stated goals of the CLCPA while giving us some lever to reduce the total number of defers that isn't going to break the model. Better than nothing. I'm not opposed.
Right, and on the zonal basis, in stage one, as long as the model solves, we've kind of accomplished that goal, because the zonal model and the capacity expansion is not necessarily going to see the individual pockets and generations. So it'll still be 2 steps. And hopefully at that number, it would still solve the capacity expansion model, and then it would be up to us to follow through with that specific siting methodology in, say, this scenario 3, if that's the choice, in scenario 3 siting methodology in stages 2 and 3, to follow that through and make sure that it still is able to build a locally reliable system. And so that would be the next consideration if that is a choice we make here. I see Julia's hand.
Yeah, I appreciate that suggestion. I think like we definitely have concerns about air quality emissions around hydrogen combustion, so I appreciate the recommendation to at least minimize or not allow the conversions of retrofits of plants in DACs. So yeah, thank you for that.
Awesome, thanks. Rodica?
I have a question on like the level of retrofit. Would that be like, I think that this was asked before too in prior conversations, but are you thinking like 100% conversion from, like when you say retrofit? And the other maybe related question to differs, in the past we're discussing green differs, green hydrogen as differs in the state scenario. Is that still an assumption here too in this high transmission impact scenario?
Yes, it would be that the green hydrogen production. Yes, it would be relying on green hydrogen. And then the way that the retrofit has flowed through before was, if there's a 100 megawatts that is currently not on hydrogen, you can switch 100 megawatts over to hydrogen combustion. So the megawatt quantity stays the same. The fuel use, the MMBTUs might change because of the different heat rates of hydrogen versus fossil fuel units, but the energy and power production can be kind of 100% retrofitted. It's just the fuel needs change.
Thank you. And you'll be solving this in the model based on the heat rates, the capex of the different scenarios. Is that how it will work? So it will still be based on economics?
That's right. So at the moment, the model has that choice, based on the cost of just paying the VONM of an existing unit versus paying that upfront cost and the higher VONM to switch it to hydrogen. So it has that choice in any given year, and as we get closer and closer to the end state, it'll be more binding because a lot of those units in that 2040 time step are going to have to retire and switch to something else or just go off the system. And in the intervening years, it's mostly about whether we need reliable firm capacity in those zones when something hits its age-based retirement limit. So most of the hydrogen retrofits are about local reliability in the nearer years, and then about reliability in general in all its meetings once it gets to 2040 and we have to be fully zero carbon.
Thank you.
Ryan?
Just weighing into the previous discussion that we certainly support the proposal made around disadvantaged communities before. In the question before, just mentioning that we support that idea.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I think that brings us most of the way through the modifications for the high transmission impact. Like I said, the focus, trying to limit the number of variables we're tweaking is around the energy and peak load forecast, winter and summer. And we're currently really circling around the Climate Action Council case 3 around accelerated shift away from combustion, though we have to look at what that looks like with the changes that Skylar had talked about a little earlier, adding in some load, looking at electrolysis, you name it. And we'll be reformatting some of these to make sure that we can clearly visualize that and the differences between the NISO high case. I expect it to come a little closer if we add in some of those large loads. And then, like we talked about, the other changes around a tweak to when we can consider hydrogen-based DEFR and where and how. And we have some suggestions to take back around middle ground to limit that without breaking the model and maybe meet some DAC related policy that we'll talk through and bring back for next time along with this other scenario. So anyone from the joint utilities, anything that I missed through the discussion of these scenarios that we'd like to bring up, and EPPAC, any other questions or comments for this high transmission impact variables that you'd want to consider that you didn't hear today, or vice versa?
Not seeing a lot of hands up, I don't think.
Yeah, there's nothing in the chat either.
Good job.
Yeah.
It is, Liz, it's just a process question. I might have missed what you said earlier. Is this material, have we made this material available yet? Is it out somewhere for people to look at?
This is a combination of stuff from NISO and NYSERDA web pages, so it's all out there, but this is something I just threw together this morning to help with the conversation. So I'm happy to, Skylar, I'll send it over to you. I know we have to make some tweaks to make it accurate, and then, it's all public, so happy to share it.
No, if you would
That'd
make any corrections you need to make, that would be helpful.
And we'll make sure to send that out either later today or sometime tomorrow to make sure folks have the chance to look at this in more detail, because this is some really great information. Pulling together the everything into the NISO style matrix as well was very helpful. Appreciate that. So Tom, did you have any other material you wanted to walk through today, or should we spend some time talking more generally about, because I know there were some open questions about DER treatment. We can kind of tread some more of that ground today too, to use some of this the rest of the time of this meeting.
I think that's most of what I had here. Maybe as an easy one to knock down before we get to that, just to get folks' input, I'll go back to the storage marginal costs change, because that is one that we figured out. We haven't exactly figured out how we want to handle the DER. Any challenges or questions or concerns around, again, now we're talking about the low case, we're moving away from the high case, the low transmission impact, utilizing a lower storage cost in alignment with the integration analysis, what they called the mid cost versus the low cost. You can see I put those figures down here for a 4-hour system at least. It gives both a kilowatt and energy value independently.
Okay, so it looks like it's about 10 to 15% cheaper storage cost over time, and as opposed to the state scenario. So that would allow the model to see a cheaper way of having that kind of short-ish duration storage to meet those capacity needs.
Yeah, and it's at least based with the integration analysis. So I think it's a reasonable bookend in terms of costs we could expect to see.
Tom, Bill Acker here. I think it's reasonable. It's funny. For a while there, storage costs really went up quite a bit with the post supply chain crunch of COVID, and I'm hearing very positive things right now in the near-term contracts that are coming through. So, I can take this back and do a little more checking with our members. It might be that the 2025 could even assume a hair lower, but I want to check that with some people.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That's one of the kind of thing we're hoping, you and others on EPPAC could provide that sort of bridge.
Okay, Skylar, sounds like no one else from the JU has anything else to bring up on this high case, and that was the one big piece we had already talked about for the low cases of JU that we were ready to discuss here. So hoping to talk about anything you're interested in.
Yeah, I think one of the key aspects of this quote unquote lower transmission impact case is just trying to kind of parse what we're talking about again, so it's clear to folks about when we're talking about a lower load scenario, but also high DER impact scenario. One of the things that we ended on last time was folks being concerned about just modifying the load forecast to quote unquote represent DER impacts might not necessarily show the full impact or value of DERs on the system because of potential impacts on other large scale renewables in the same area or backflow, those types of things where storage and other local resources might meet most or all the local power demands in a given area, and that can have different impacts on the capacity expansion build out than just modifying the load forecast in that zone for a given year, for example. So that's something where we wanted to talk through a little bit more. What are the potential ways that thinking through how it actually happens in the real world? What are some options for maybe updating the capacity expansion assumptions to represent that better? Like, is there anything else we can do in the capacity expansion kind of zonal level stuff that we're doing here in stage one? What are our options to try to better represent the impact of DERs on the higher voltage system? I'm not sure if anybody has any ideas or any different phrasings they want to ask that question, but that's kind of the high level discussion we wanted to have. Aaron?
Thank you, Skylar. I just want us to be clear on how the DERs are being defined, because there is utility or customer side at behind the meter solar. There is, some load control potentially. I don't know if the load control is expected to be distinct from the EV charging. And I think it could help just level set on what exactly we mean by DER, because I think that will drive how we respond to your question.
No, that's a really good point. So far, for EVs, just starting there's been, I don't think there's really been any assumptions on bidirectional capability. So when we talk about EVs, they're a load in the model that depending on the scenario assumptions, can have some flexibility about when they are charged. So that's one, it's not necessarily what I'd be talking about in terms of new DERs, because that's strictly load modification. It's just moving when the load might happen. So flexibility is where that would fall under, and that's something different than DERs that we're talking about. Distributed, behind the meter solar on residences, which is a big part, not all of it, but it's a big part of solar development. That also just strictly modifies the load at the host site, and we've been able to just treat that as a load modifier as well. So when we're talking about DER deployment, we're really talking about those slightly larger front of the meter solar facilities and energy storage on the distribution network. Those are the two primary ones that would be utilized here. And so when we're thinking about how DERs can be deployed, if we're assuming something, there's a lot of ways we could go wrong. If we just put in a a given load shape, that might underestimate the value of storage on the distribution network, because we have the ability to potentially change the signals for when that discharges to actually optimize that according to whatever the needs of the day are. So preemptively choosing a shape for, say, distributed storage might underestimate the value. So that's one of the issues about only doing everything through load shapes ahead of time. Storage and solar are both options in the model at a zonal level. So there is potentially the capability to do this just at the zonal level, and then adjust the location of those assets to be DERs, some fraction of them to be DERs in stage 2 and 3 when we build out the nodal model. But just thinking through, and I see John threw up his hand right as I was saying that, so I'm gonna let John jump in here and clarify anything. But there's lots of ways we could think through how to incorporate DERs in the model. John, did you have something to say about that?
Just wanted to add something else to the list to think about as we consider those various options that particularly on the last potential option that you were going through there of reciting some of what comes out of the nodal capacity or zonal capacity expansion to the distribution side. Three things we have to be cautious about and think about the potential impacts of as we consider these options are: one, that a supply curve developed for utility scale resources connected to transmission is not the same as a supply curve developed for distribution level resources. And so it may be an avenue to get some shifts, but we want to think about the potential impacts and differences. We're not going to capture costs appropriately necessarily that way. The other piece of that is that we can't assume that the associated distribution upgrades would be zero either. So if we're looking at the most cost-effective overall build-out, we need to think of some ways that we can appropriately represent those distribution costs as we think about making those shifts as well.
Both great points. Yes. So Aaron, did you have a follow-up? I know you wanted to clarify kind of what we're talking about. And I think that the main thing when we're talking about stuff that's going to make the biggest impact is when we're talking about gigawatts of new front-of-the-meter solar and storage. We haven't necessarily as a state taken that dive in starting to assume massive deployment of bidirectional charging capabilities. I suppose that could be put on the table as well, although I'm not sure exactly how we would represent that in model, maybe just as a storage resource, but that's primarily what we're talking about.
Okay, that's helpful. And I think, this is the first go around with the planning process. And I think Yatchi presented last week how, the ideal will be to transition to a 2-year cycle. So it probably is wise to do as thorough a job as possible at this juncture for this go around. And then just make improvements as we get better information and tools improve. I will just say the concern that you expressed. I think you said potentially undervalue storage. The ISO has improved the time slicing, and it's a complicated exercise. So certainly for the outlook this time around, it's an improvement, but it's still not going to be perfect. You could be overestimating the benefit of storage as well. So I don't think we'll ever know, right? You just won't know. They're doing the best they can with the way the model operates, fine. But I just think I'd be cautious to characterize it as underestimating storage. The one thing though too, in response to the supply curve distribution versus the supply curve for transmission, is it my understanding that when the JU is in stage 5, they will be taking a look at that one incremental, comparing 2 alternatives of runs on the headroom, and I think that's stage 5, to make sure the model doesn't overload one area with a bunch of DER and then turn around and have to pay a fortune to upgrade it, when if it went to a different location, we might have had perhaps more expense because of land cost, but perhaps less transmission. And I guess, is stage 5 the area where we would pick up that point that John brought up?
That's a good question. I know, if we're doing a DER centric scenario and we're trying to have the model give preference to citing more resources as distribution resources to avoid those upgrade costs, we would be doing that citing and running the analyses in stages 2 and 3, followed up by determining what transmission upgrades are required in stage 4 based on those build outs. Stage 5, I believe, is rerunning this capacity expansion model with all of that new stuff added in, with the transmission upgrades, with the DERs where there would be, and all that good stuff to check, the new capacity expansion build out and how everything works. But I think what you're referring to is, how do we check whether the DER siting actually had those benefits, or if they just we were being too cheap with it and actually created more issues. I think that would probably be solved somewhere in stages 3 and 4 when we're citing those things and then running all the local transmission models to figure out what the needs are of the system and trying to propose solutions to those needs.
Yeah,
and we'd be able to kind of wiggle things around then.
Okay, but in stage 5, just to make sure I understand this clearly, the utilities will be representing the distribution to the extent they have subzonal capabilities in the or in their capacity expansion model, but they won't have all those original units that were selected in stage 1, or I think, are we in stage 2? No, stage 1. Anyways, that it will assess in the model whether or not the results are consistent with what was in stage 1. And I hope I clarified that. I think they have a hurdle rate or something that, it was very clever the way it was explained to me. I was pleased that they were going to be able to do that in stage 5.
I think the way you described that is correct. Yeah,
Okay.
stage 5 is supposed to be the check back on the stage 1 run with all the potential upgrades that were required built in, so we can see how everything worked, to make sure we did solve everything, that the model's solvable, it's the least cost build out, those types of things, that everything works together.
Okay. All right, you answered my questions. I don't have a great solution right now, but you answered my question, so thank you.
All right, Pamela?
Nice. Yeah.
Thanks, Skylar. I'm just kind of curious, as you're talking about distributed energy resources, understanding a little bit how you're factoring in things like segmentation or differentiation between front of the meter and the behind the meter resources for distributed energy resources, just kind of factoring in all the IRA and IIJA funding going into behind the meter DERs. And then the other thing that I'm curious about is how, or if you're considering other types of load flexibility within that distributed energy resource, which I consider also DER, which is like building electrification, building flexibility, thermal storage, managed charging, and obviously you mentioned it earlier about V2X or V2G.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in a traditional sense, all of that is a distributed energy resource for sure, and our definitions are always kind of wonky because they keep changing in all these scenarios. But we do have what we have termed in these processes as those flexibility assumptions. We have those around vehicle managed charging is the primary one. I think in our base scenario, that's the primary flexibility that we enable the model to choose, like shifting that plus or minus 4 hours, but keeping it within the same day. When you layer on the higher flexibility scenarios that were done in the integration analysis, they layered on things like flexibility in building loads. Because of the electrification, you now have the ability to kind of shift that electrical, say, heat pump load plus or minus a few hours, and there were a number of other assumptions there as well. But I don't think that has been built into our scenarios here. That could be a sensitivity where we just ratchet up the flexibility assumptions, but that has not been kind of a primary focus here outside of the EV loads. In terms of differentiating between behind the meter and front of the meter, none of that has been done yet because we don't really have those assumptions for this type of a project so far, this modeling run, because we're talking at the moment, everything that's built in as a quote unquote candidate resource is a zonal, large scale front of the meter asset. And so there hasn't been any differentiation about front of the meter versus behind the meter. If we were going to somehow try to build in DERs as, quote unquote candidate resources for the model to choose, we would have to layer in a whole bunch of new information. John mentioned one of them, the interconnection, the distribution upgrades that may be required to integrate all that DER. We'd have to have a different supply curve cost for all those resources. We'd also want to build in the values, the avoided transmission and distribution losses, for example, and the fact that all these resources are eligible for IRA funding, but local resources, if we can prove where they are, they might be eligible for even more funding, and so that would want to be layered on. None of that has been done yet. We haven't decided if the model is even able to incorporate those new candidate resources within zones and within utility territories, and then even a step further, differentiate between front of the meter, behind the meter. So that's probably one step further than we've gone so far, and is probably something we would need someone from the NISO's modeling team to give us a gut check on. And Chi, I'm not sure if Sarah or Jason are on. I don't think I've seen them on. Oh, Sarah, I think I see Sarah on now. Maybe if you have the chance, Sarah, would you be able to just say in a few sentences what you all may or may not be able to do in terms of adding new candidate resources that may cover this whole concept of incorporating DER as a choice instead of large scale?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Karkner with the NISO. So I know we talked a bit about the flexible loads and charging, and Skylar covered that in a bit. So I think that's certainly one avenue that you could do to capture some sort of a DER. But in terms of the candidate resources that we've been talking about here, I think there's certainly the capability to do that in the model. And like Skylar said, the bigger question there is just what do you assume for the assumptions? What are the cost assumptions? What kind of constraints or limitations do you put on it for how much can be built where? And I think just once all of those assumptions are pinned down and there's, a reasonable set of assumptions for what that DER could be, technically speaking, we would have the capability to include that in the model. So I think that's just probably requires more discussion as to what all of those parameters would be. So I hope that helped answer the question, Skylar. Let me know if there's anything else that you were looking for at this time. Thanks.
No, that was exactly right. That helped a lot. I think one of the main things is that this has never been done before. Even in the integration analysis, for example, the 10 gigawatt solar goal was just a load modifier. The energy storage, basically all of that was assumed to operate at augmenting the transmission load profile in an optimized fashion. And there wasn't like a breakdown of distribution versus transmission siting for that. So we'd be treading new ground, which is very fun and interesting, but also a little bit scary and dangerous. So I'm happy to be led one direction or the other by folks who have strong feelings about, maybe the best way to incorporate DERs. Having done this before on, two storage roadmaps and pathways work and integration analysis, all that good stuff. The danger is really, trying to get the prices right and the values in the model. Because if we have roughly the similar, costs for, say, bulk storage versus distributed storage, but distributed storage has an extra, 20% adder that it can get, say, from the federal government, the model is only going to choose that, and you'll have 100% of your storage be on the distribution network. So we'd have to then build in additional layers of maybe supply curves, for example, which we don't have today and might be maybe too big of a lift to pull off in the next month. But there may be, simplified assumptions we could have, like 1 or 2 or 3 step supply curves, or maximum capabilities of DERs within a given zone, something like that, just to, spark some people's imaginations. There may be other things that we can do to incorporate behind the meter versus front of the meter DERs into these kind of candidate resources, so that we can maybe make a modeled / optimized decision here, as opposed to, what I had mentioned earlier, about, just letting the model run and then using our stage 2 and 3 model development and build out to cite those in a different way than what the model had originally done. That obviously glosses over some of the other cost and operational impacts. But it's obviously, it's still a choice, and it's probably better than nothing. And we might be able to resolve some of those issues in the rerun of the modeling in stage 5. So that's just, all these considerations need to be kind of taken into account.
Skylar, I think we'll have to take that back as the JU, but just based on what we've been talking off the top of my head, I'm thinking that the latter of what you described is probably more in alignment with what we've been envisioning, rather to the former, and the important distinction being, as an input to the model, that we'll try and do some optimization on that input ahead of time, versus as a model output, which is a whole lot more variables for the model to consider, makes the results that much more difficult to interpret. So again, we'll have to take this back, but I tend to think that as an input with an asterisk, that we'll think really hard about the input and make sure that it makes sense in the context of the rest of the model and is somewhat optimized, but avoiding trying to co-optimize DG versus LSR and turn this into a DG versus LSR forum, which could effectively happen.
I mean, that is where with all the pitfalls, that's still where we're hoping to go in the long term, is that we have a system-wide optimization where we can get more and more granular as we go. But I think in general, I tend to agree with you at the moment, just because even if we had 2 or 3 extra months to come to conclusion about what a distribution supply curve for DERs between here and 2040, and all those costs and savings, what those could be, that I don't think we have time for that, and it might add confusion and a lot of extra assumptions development that we don't have time for. But I'm totally happy to start those discussions now for cycle 2 and see if we can reach that more optimized level by the time we're ready to kind of kick off these things next time. But as always, on topics like this, when there's a lot of potential opinions and impacts, please, anybody throw things in the chat, raise your hand, send us emails on the EPPAC email address with all your thoughts on these. If you have preferences or opinions on or experience on these types of things, we'd love to have that information. Rodica?
Thank you. I have 2 comments, one on DER and one in general, just building on those questions related to what happens in stage 2 and 4 and 5. It might be very beneficial for all our group to have a more detailed presentation on what is to happen at each stage, and there were some points earlier in the EPPAC meetings about what deliverables are, who does what. Might be very beneficial to have a presentation maybe before the end of the year or early January on what is to happen at each stage, just for all of us to be level set on that.
Rodica, are you thinking something beyond what's in the utilities filing and the order?
I'm thinking maybe like first like summarize, I mean like even like what's in the order, but also maybe additional details that could be offered and relative to the touch points for EPPAC that were proposed in the CGPP timelines. We added some touch points for even for stage 3 and 4.
Yeah, no, I think there's going to be some, I don't know, Skylar, is that, you plan to talk about that next time?
Yeah, so next time we are going to, try to finish out on December 11th or whenever that meeting ends up being, going through scenario 2 and trying to wrap more of these scenario assumptions up. And then the rest of the meeting was going to be on the headroom assumptions and methodology and marginal transmission costs. I'm not sure we'll have time in that meeting on December 11th to also do kind of this higher level overview of the process, and maybe just walking through, for example, just an example of what a scenario is going to do and who's running what and when the handoffs are and what the timeline looks like. It seems like that might be helpful to folks. Maybe that can be something we reserve for the first meeting in January. We could walk through, what the steps are and when we expect things to happen and what the EPPAC touch points are. Because you're right, we are in the process of drafting that updated timeline that shows the EPPAC touch points, and we received, I think, 2 members have provided feedback on that timeline so far. If you have more feedback on, preferences for when those touch points should happen or what we should accomplish in those touch points, feel free to send those over. But we do hope to use that first meeting in January to do something like this and kind of finalize that EPPAC timeline with the proposed touch points.
Great. And I see more hand raised probably maybe on this comment too, but just for the other comment I had on DER, some of the concerns we have on the large scale generation and something that we are seeing play out in more areas of the grid is that, we have even like contracted assets, and then it's enough to have a 20 megawatt DER resource that eats that local headroom. And maybe one way to look into this, or something maybe to be further considered, is how this DER mapping will be happening, and if there is any distinction that can be made between DER that is not exported to the local system because you have enough load at the distribution level versus DER that may be in areas versus DER that you have backflows from because there is not enough load there. But that's the concern we are seeing in some of the studies and like real projects on the ground where you have 2 to 3 DER resources, and it's enough to have that local headroom eaten up.
Right. So that would be something we would have to track, because I don't think we can proactively do much on that in stage 1 as we're doing this build out, because we won't have kind of the nodal representation and the very localized load and voltage information on the system until the later stages. But that would be something we could track with the siting of this quote unquote higher penetration DERs. We have some control over where that goes, and with the information about what the loads look like, we might be able to kind of optimize that. We might that moves us a little bit farther away from reality and the way development works on the ground, but it does move us more towards avoiding the negative impacts on LSRs and maximizing benefits to minimizing transmission.
But
so,
it would be beneficial to take into account at least the more advanced DER resources, because those may be getting built irrespective of like the views here. So I think some touch point with the DER queue would be very beneficial, because also the short lead time for DER resources compared to larger scale renewables and transmission. And I know in some cases there are upgrades to be made, but those are mostly at the distribution level. So maybe there are ways to capture how much it could get built in some locations, some sort of like of potential DER, and that potential DER may show still that it can have impacts on the local distribution, local system, not distribution system.
Yep, that'll be important to account for in our citing methodology when we're citing those things and accounting for any of those costs. Just and John from NYSERDA had mentioned that as well. I think that's a good point.
Thank you.
I think Nicea's had a hand up for a while.
Thanks, Liz.
Dhruv Patel. Dhruv, do you still have a question?
Yeah. Hey, Skylar, I had a question. I mean, I think we just jumped off, but I want to confirm if my understanding is right. So let's say if we do have a layer for DER and related costs, but still the CGPP stage 2 of the siting of the resources would still be at a zonal level, right? That granularity doesn't change. Is that right?
In stage 1, that's correct. Yep, we wouldn't get that more granular citing of a specific DER until stage 2 and 3.
Understood. Thank you.
Yep. Raya?
Hello. Yes. So just, as we're talking about these really important sort of complexities of how we're going to treat the DERs, I wanted to raise this idea that I think that's been batted around a bit about just tracking IRA energy communities, tax credit adders that perhaps add a sensitivity, maybe as part of the load transmission impact scenario, to add zonal multipliers that reflect IRA tax credits for different resources based on the prevalence of energy communities within each modeling zone. And the reason for this idea was that it could help us kind of get a look at what's going on in our, it's sort of a proxy energy communities for disadvantaged communities, and may inform some of this DER discussion. So I wanted to mention that and see what you or others thought about doing that.
That's a really good point, because when we're talking about a hypothetical future where there might be high DER penetration, if certain areas are going to have 10, 20, 30% higher tax credits, you probably will see prioritization of those areas in reality. So that's something we would want to capture when we're doing our citing methodology. So I think from my point of view, there's obviously two ways that goes forward. Is there's either some additional tax credit provided to assets developed in certain areas. It seems like we were moving away from building in a candidate DER supply curve into the model, the model choose, so we wouldn't necessarily be adding a local tax credit to that portion. But what we would be able to do potentially in the citing is, once we've had resources chosen, if we were doing citing, we could potentially cite the resources in areas that are the energy communities at those nodes, based on the assumption that they would prioritize those areas because there's bigger tax credits there, and we might be able to flow that decision through later stages in the modeling. But there might be other things I'm not thinking about in terms of maybe allowing some proportion of resources in a given zone to get those types of local tax credits. John, did you raise your hand for this topic?
Yeah, I just wanted to note, I think you hit on it, Skylar, but I just wanted to make it really clear for everyone in case it's not. Like, we can't go back and develop a supply curve for DERs in the time frames we're trying to work in for this round. There isn't time for that, and it's not even like a 2 or 3 month process. That's something that would be significantly longer to get into all the work for. We spent about 9 months developing, or I should say updating, the supply curve for large scale resources. So just as we continue these discussions, I want everyone to be on, have that in the back of their minds, that that's not really a round one option to be able to do that.
Right, yeah. I'll go for it, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to be real explicit about it. And another thing that occurred to me as part of the discussion around ways that we can leverage citing methodology to start to represent some of that for a lower impact scenario. One thing we'll have to think about for that is, because we're getting zonal build outs, there may be zones where we just don't really have large scale candidate resources to shift. And so we may even have to think through the mechanics of, especially if you're trying to think about those, where all of those energy communities are and how to create a bias towards those to represent the impact of those tax credits. We may need to think through some interzonal complications involved with that as well.
Are you referring to maybe interzonal in the sense of like creating more than one candidate resource for that zone to represent, a more localized resource?
I mean, really, like there is not a lot. If you look at the supply curve, and say we were talking about solar, right? You don't really have in the large scale renewable supply curve that's being leveraged a lot of those resources existing in the supply curve below zone G. So if we wanted to look at, say, things in zone J, and again, I'm just making up an example, not trying to get into the weeds of the specifics. It's one more thing we have to think about. You may not have large scale candidate resources or sufficient large scale candidate resources in a zone within that same zone utilize a siting methodology to put some more in the distribution, even though that may be more representative of where we see DER going closer to load and where we see higher potential for some of those tax incentives and so on. So it's not shooting it down by any means, but just flagging one more thing we would have to think through as we're going down this path of thinking about how we could potentially leverage the siting methodology to have a middle ground between, what folks might desire in the long terms of actually having some sort of DER supply curve versus not having any shifted representation right now.
Okay. I think that last 2 sentences really clarified it for me. So we might have the bulk supply curve showing maybe a few dozen megawatts of bulk solar in zone J, when in reality we already have maybe 400 megawatts of distributed solar in zone J with hundreds more available, but they're all in 500 kilowatt to 1 megawatt chunks, which would not show up in the supply curve. So if we do want to do a high DER preference, the model is not going to necessarily build all those megawatts into zone J, so we'd have to figure out how to make it do that without being able to shift large scale resources to be local resources. So we'd have to do that some other way.
One proxy we had come up with going all the way back to December when we initially proposed the joint utilities coordinated grid planning process before this order, in treating this as an input. One of the reasons we felt a little bit better about treating this as an input as opposed to having it modeled beyond the technical limitations that we've been discussing is I think each of the joint utilities members has been doing a little bit more in the last 5 years to forecast at the distribution level. And speaking for National Grid, at least, and this is why we have to take this back and talk a little more, but I know our solar forecasts, particularly for upstate, go a long way in looking at some of the considerations that you'd want to look at for a supply curve, looking at land availability, looking at hosting capacity, trying to model developer decisions. And we have a couple different versions of those forecasts, some that have higher DER penetration and some that have lower. So while the model's not in a place where it can do that optimization today with a supply curve, even if it did exist, which we're not going to be able to put together, maybe as a follow-up, us utilities can go back and look at our forecasting, or at least our forecasting methodologies, and see if there's anything we can take from that to utilize as an input here, understanding that the distribution experts work through those forecasts and they're probably something close to reality or optimal. The other benefit of doing that is now you're going to align with distribution planning practices, for example, cost share 2.0. So if you're utilizing the same distribution forecast that your distribution planners are using and showing for example, 40 megawatts of DG on a station with a 20 megawatt bank, those distribution planners should also see that and should have a cost share 2.0 project in queue that would alleviate that headroom and allow us to model the full 40 megawatts flowing through without having to deal with the idea of having a distribution upgrade flow through CGPP, which is not what it's designed for right now.
So again, something we have to take back as a joint utilities, but maybe another middle ground where we can use it as an input, but we have confidence in the work that's gone on through the REV process to develop those inputs as being somewhat optimal.
Right. And I guess storage will probably be less of an issue with the siting of that. It's more about how you assume it operates. But for the solar side, I think what you just said makes sense for enabling additional solar build out beyond the current assumptions, which I think are like 10 gigawatts by 2030, and then some more as we see fit. I think it might go up to 12 or something like that on distribution storage. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but we might be able to scale those load modifiers, or we might be able to rely on some of those other forecasts, like you mentioned, to push more solar in this high DER scenario than otherwise. But I think to answer Raya's original question about how to potentially push those, better tax credits that do exist for certain communities, based on what John has said and Tom said, I'm not convinced we'll be able to necessarily build that into stage 1, but we can build the concept probably into our siting of projects in stages 2 and 3. If we have 5 projects in a certain zone, and two of the nodes are in those communities that are eligible for much higher tax credits, and 2 of the nodes aren't, we can give preference to the areas that will likely pay those projects more to site there. So we'll be able to maybe enable that same build out through our siting methodology.
Thank you very much for capping that off with answering my question. Thank you very much. That sounds great.
Yeah, we took a wide route to get there, but I think we kind of got there.
Very interesting one. Thank you to Tom and and everyone.
Hey, Keith.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Just got a little bit confused. I'd like a clarification on that.
Hey, Keith. Hey, Keith. Can you get closer to your mic or something? You're very faint.
Wearing a headset, I can't get much closer. With the particularly with the headroom information that the NISO has recently received from the utilities, how was the DER considered in those headroom calculations, or is the DER anticipated to go against the headroom calculation?
Sorry, Keith, could you say that again? I missed your question.
I think the question was how do DERs count against the headroom, or do they?
At this point, I don't think we have not said that the DER would count against the headroom. That's not something we're assuming at this point. Interestingly enough, Tom Vaccaro and I, sorry, this is Jeff Marr from National Grid, we're kind of having a sidebar conversation that could be one way we could try to factor in the DER's impact is to use headroom, but the numbers may be difficult to get to alignment. The calculations of the headroom may not really account for the DER in a way that the model could accurately account for the DER and the LSR correctly. So we'd have to think about that a little bit more, but at this point, I guess the answer is the headroom does not consider the DER.
This is Nicholas Colbart with PCG Long Island. I just want to say it differently. I would say it assumes a specific assumption for DER that's built into the forecast, which doesn't deviate for the headroom calculations.
Right. So to put those two things together, then there's some baseline quantity of DERs in the model, and that's what the headroom is based on. But additional DERs that are built in, necessarily, if they're augmenting the load profile or something, they might not count directly against the headroom. But hypothetically, they would change the headroom if you had rerun the headroom analysis with them being there. But they're not right now. Like, it's not going to count against the headroom.
Yeah,
I think
thanks.
Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
think that's right.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, so at best it will augment what the model sees in terms of, you know, load that can be met. And so it will change the model's decision making about what to build to meet whatever remaining load there is. So in that way it does kind of augment the decision making, but it doesn't preemptively, you know, reduce on a fixed way what is like eligible or able to be built in a given zone, which does happen in reality. You know, in reality, there would be like certain areas or certain stations that are just kind of off limits now because there's so much of that DER development. But it sounds like our methodology is not going to obviously be that granular in stage one, but there will be some representation, maybe through the load modification, that does impact the ability to site additional large-scale renewables. Okay, Aaron?
Yeah, I just want to put a placeholder in as we're going about these additional, what I would call exogenous adjustments before the model. I think I just want to reemphasize we need to pay attention to having the data point and the outcome is what this costs and what each scenario is estimated to cost. And so to the extent we're making these adjustments to have a reasonable, you know, representation of what DER and a high DER penetration scenario is, I want us to also contemplate how we're going to capture the cost of this.
That's a great point. And I think we had gotten off track on that a little bit earlier, which is why, you know, I think John had brought us back to like, you can't just assume there's no distribution upgrade costs, because there's also, you know, interconnection costs for DERs, there's capital costs, you know, there's potential distribution upgrades that could be needed once we cross certain thresholds. So that's definitely something we need to incorporate somehow in, say, a high DER scenario, because there is not infinite capacity on the distribution network. So that is something to definitely keep in mind and account for as we go through.
Okay, thank you.
This is Nicholas Culpepper, PCG Long Island. I think Aaron has a really good point, and though perhaps we don't have an answer right now, I think I agree. I think it is worth emphasizing the importance of keeping our finger on the pulse, if you will, in that regard. In that, like, each zone is going to be different, but I know internally to PSCG Long Island, there's a lot of constraints with DER. So whatever we look to assume as far as DER is concerned, I see at a bare minimum that gets vetted through the respective utilities to make sure it makes sense based off the current information on hand and those known limitations and constraints.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I like the suggestion earlier about, you know, there are SIRQs that show, you know, those types of per megawatt costs for upgrades in certain locations, you know, eligible megawatts that are moving through the queue in certain areas. So when we're doing the siting methodology, we can rely on some of that information to give us an indication about what the costs that we need to be building into future stages of the model would have to be to enable that type of build out. And what Tom said about maybe having, you know, some cost sharing 2.0 type projects to leverage, those types of things are all stuff that we need to keep in mind as we go forward.
It's Liz, I just want to drop in and just, well, drop a reminder that at the origin of this whole process is, you know, the legislature's determination that utilities, you know, with the PSC should identify their distribution and local transmission upgrades as well as bulk upgrades, but distribution upgrades necessary to help meet CLCPA. So, and the overall objective there, of course, as the Commission said in the various orders on CTPP, is to come up with, you know, cost-effective, you know, is to come up with those, identify those upgrades at the different levels of the system, and then, you know, select projects that are going to be cost-effective. So to your point, Aaron, yes, we're very concerned about the cost of the distribution build out, and this process should begin to show us what we need.
Excellent. Okay, I don't see any more hands, and I know we went through a lot there in these last 2 hours. So I think I'm going to call it here. So I have just enough time to say that you know, another plug for those emails that were sent out over the last couple weeks. You know, check out any of that information. We will also be sending out two things now after this meeting. You know, one is the information that was shown on the screen earlier, just to give people kind of a reference data set to look at in between now and next time. And also, I will be sending out an email related to the timing for the next meeting. We have had it on the calendar for December 11th at 2 to 4 p.m., but that is during the last session of the 0x40 technical conference. And so I'll be sending out kind of like a survey of folks to see if they're okay keeping this time or if we should try to move it. So those two things will be coming in the next couple days. But thank you so much, everybody, for your participation. I think it was a great meeting. Made a lot of headway, and we'll pick it up on scenario 2 again next time. Thanks a lot, and have a great day.
Thank you.
So have a good day.
Thank you.